All right, welcome everybody. We'll get started. Welcome to the fourth installment of Peter's Q&A chats with us online in the group. We have three other members and myself as part of the group admin team. I'm Don Newman. I teach math in Maryland. We have Jill, who teaches in Chicago. Dana is in Tennessee, and Abby is from California. Abby is the founder of the group as well. 3.5 years, right, for the group. And then, of course, we have Peter Liljedahl, that everyone is. That's why you're here. It's not to see the rest of us. He's graciously agreed to give some more of his time to talk to us about some more of the particulars of BTC. So we'll get started. What we did was polled the group to see what the interest was, what types of questions they wanted us to ask. And so we drew these questions from the results of that poll. So one of the questions that came up, and it comes up frequently in the group beyond just the poll, is the different types of tasks. There are rich tasks, there are thin slice tasks, and there's some confusion around them, first of all, and there are some similarities and some differences, and what you do in a lesson with one type of task versus the other. Some things are the same, some things are different. So if you could go ahead and address those in general, that would be great, Peter.
Happy to. First of all, thanks for hosting again. And I can't believe it's a fourth one. I thought it was a third one. Okay, but obviously I'm not very good at counting. So tasks, ironically, Megan Giroux is here with us. She's here somewhere. Say hi, Megan. As a participant, Megan is my co-author on the latest book, which is all about tasks. So let's talk a little bit about tasks. So there's lots of ways that we can divide up tasks into categories, right? So the world is full of tasks, right? If you do a Google search for problem of the day or problem of the week, I think you could get hits in the billions. There's endless books published on this. There are so many tasks out there. How do we categorize these? And there's so many ways that we can categorize them, right? We can categorize them as good tasks or bad tasks, right? There was a point in my research where I was categorizing tasks according to whether or not it inspired students to want to talk to each other or not, right? So there's so many different ways that we can take this huge collage of tasks and sort them out. So the way I tend to think about it is that we have curricular tasks and non-curricular tasks. So that is a way to divide it into two piles. Okay. So a curricular task is a task that is going to hit content from your curriculum. A non-curricular task is a task that is clearly mathematical, but isn't going to hit content from your curriculum. So a really good example of that is tax collector, right? Tax collector is a great task. It really deals a lot with, and if you don't know that task, it's in the Orange Book in chapter 6, but it deals with prime numbers and composite numbers and squares of prime numbers. And so it really, it hits content depending on where you are for students in grade 6 or 7 or maybe 8. But if you're using that with your senior students, your grade 12 students, you're clearly doing math, but you're not hitting curricular content for you. So that would be a non-curricular task. Then we can have sort of rich tasks as a category and non-rich tasks. So what is a rich, be clear here now, a rich task, we're not dividing up this curricular, non-curricular. That pie has been divided. We've put it on the shelf and it's just sitting there cooling. We can take this whole pile of tasks again that exist in the world and we can divide them into rich tasks and non-rich tasks. So what is a rich task? So a rich task is a task that sort of causes students to encounter multiple areas of content. that may or may not be from their curriculum, but it requires them to maybe use some number theory. They're doing a bit of graphing. They're looking at probability. Like it just pulls in a lot of different mathematics, a lot of different ways to think about it. So, for example, 3D tic-tac-toe is a rich task in that it prompts students to think about it in a lot of different ways. Now, the thing about rich tasks is that some students may hit curricular content for you, content from your curriculum, and some students may not, right? So that's the thing about when you have a rich task is that you can't guarantee that everyone's going to do it the same way, right? They may not encounter the same mathematics. If you want to ensure that they're going to hit the same mathematics, then we start putting constraints on it, and we start sort of reducing the openness, the richness of this task down to what we often see in our textbooks as a word problem, right? A word problem is a task that has been so constrained that it's kind of guaranteeing that everyone is going to do it exactly the same way, right? They're going to pull out the 4 decimal numbers out of the task, out of the word problem. They're going to line them up, they're going to add them up, and they're going to get an answer, and every single student's going to do the same thing. But it's not a very rich task because everyone does it the same way. There isn't a lot of variability. So that's another way to think about it. Another way to take the pile of tasks in the world and cut it into pieces is a new parsing that Megan and I talked about in the new task book, and that's convergent and divergent. So a divergent task is a task where everybody does it slightly differently. So it can be considered a rich task, right? So it diverges. Everyone does it a different way, right? And a convergent task is a task where pretty much everyone does it the same way. Now, it doesn't have to be a word problem. There are good tasks out there that cause students to think, but pretty much everyone thinks the same way. So, how many sevens are there from 1 to 1,000? It's mostly convergent. Pretty much everyone thinks about it more or less the same way. The order in which they think about it may be different, but they pretty much think about it. But it's still a great task, right? It's still a great task, but it kind of converges. So there's lots of different ways to take this pile of tasks that exist in the world and categorize it into different parts, right? And it depends on what you're trying to achieve, and it depends on what you're talking about. Now, thin slicing is a particular way of dealing with convergent curricular tasks. So a simple example is solving 1 and 2 step equations, adding fractions. Maybe it is using the area model to divide numbers. It could be factoring quadratics, completing the square, right? Doing transformations on parabolas. There's these are topics that exist within our curricula that is made up of a whole collection of smaller tasks, right? So it doesn't matter what it is we're doing. Let's take dividing, using the area model to divide, right? So if I'm dividing 48 divided by 2 using the area model, I can break that down into 40 and 8, and I can do the division, and it's relatively simple, right? I'm using the area model. But if I do 56 divided by 4, it's a different type of question, because it doesn't break across a tens place. 4 doesn't go into 50, and so on and so forth. So there's nuance here. So how do we move students through a progression from something really simple, like 1/5 plus 3/5? If we're talking about adding fractions, that maybe is a good example. 1/5 plus 3/5, easy, right? And that's adding fractions. But adding fractions is also 3 2/3 plus 5 3/4. That's also adding fractions. That's a very different flavor of adding fractions. So how do we get students to go from 1/5 plus 3/5 to 3 2/3 plus 5 3/4? And what we have to do is build a series of experiences between those where the tasks are getting progressively harder, just slightly so, where we're having shifts in very small shifts. And so what I talk about in chapter 9 of the Orange Book, but very small shifts so that the students stay engaged, they stay in flow, so that the challenge of the task is increasing only slightly as their ability increases. And then in a single lesson, we can actually take students from 1/5 plus 3/5 all the way up to 3 2/3 plus 5 3/4. And that's thin slicing, is that sequence of maybe 20 to 30 questions, tasks that each gets progressively harder. Now, these are convergent tasks. They are curricular tasks. On their own, they're not necessarily considered a rich task, but across a spectrum of all of them, we could say richness is encountered. And they are curricular because we are engaging in curricular content. Now, if I use a rich task, like an open middle task from Robert Kaplinski's work, or say consider tax collector, which is a rich task, I still need to have extensions, because one of the rules in a thinking classroom, and this is a hard and fast rule, is that nobody ever gets to be done. So when somebody has solved tax collector to a certain level, there's got to be a next question. But unlike the adding fraction example where they can come up with a first answer very quickly, they're going to spend maybe 5 to 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes on the first question in tax collector. So then when I give them an extension, they're going to spend another 5 to 10 minutes on that one. And I give an extension, they're going to spend another 5 to 10. So we call that thick slicing. So thick slicing is when we have extensions inside of rich tasks because they just take longer. And thin slicing is when we have progression inside a curricular task because often they just go quick. Then we can talk about specific curricula like CPM and illustrative mathematics, and Abigail knows these ones well, which are curricular tasks, but they have a richness to them. And they behave more like a rich tasks where we have to thick slice them. At least that's kind of how they're written in the book, but you can kind of do a sort of a thick slice or a medium slice on those. And Megan and I actually talk about that in part 4 of the Green Book. So one of the things to really keep in mind here is that every time we put language to tasks, we're basically finding different ways to cut the same pie, right? Where the pie is the collection of tasks. I don't know if I added clarity or complexity to that.
No, I think that's terrific. Well, by adding some complexity, right, which is what you did, because there's more than just one piece of pie now, right? It actually makes things clear. So I think that's terrific.
And like the landscape, one of the things that I run into all the time. So I was just in Australia. I spent 3 weeks in Australia like a week ago, and everywhere I went in Australia, I kept running into these initiatives to create more tasks, more tasks. We have to have more tasks. And language like rich tasks, they talk about challenging tasks there. They talk about contemporary numeracy tasks. Like there's so many different words that we can add to this. But it's an endeavor that pretty much the math education community has been working on for the last 50 years, is this idea of creating more tasks, as if that is going to solve our problem, right? And like my whole argument in the Orange Book is that we do need good tasks. Tasks are a necessary ingredient, but they're far from sufficient. We also got to shift our pedagogy, right? But I still, no matter where I go in the world, I run into initiatives of finding new tasks, more tasks, like something like somehow what we're really missing is a collection of tasks that's going to solve all our problems. And one of the questions I get asked all the time is like, where are the tasks? Like where? And I'm like, it's like, I'm not keeping them from you. It's not like I have this secret store of tasks that are just going to solve all our problems. It's the tasks I have, you have. It's what we do with them, right? Tasks are inert. We got to use pedagogy to bring them to life.
Right. But my answer in more plainer English is BTC is how you teach, not what you teach, right? The tasks are what you teach. This is how you do it. So,
absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for that. Dana, I think has the next question.
Okay, so in our poll, we've got several who would like to know, what have you noticed recently about successful timelines for implementing the practices?
Yeah, so if you've read the Orange Book diligently, you know that chapter 15 has what I call the Building Thinking Classroom framework for implementation in it. And that was an empirically deduced framework. It's developmental in nature. It's developmental for the teachers, developmental for the students, and it takes a 14 practices and breaks it into 4 toolkits. That's the empirical result. And that's really important to understand, is that that is not the result I was hoping for. I didn't think that was going to be the order that we should be implementing these things in, but the data very clearly said that is the order. And I spent many years trying to understand why that was the order that it wanted, right? So the first toolkit, thinking, tasks, random groups, vertical surfaces, build a culture. And you got to implement all 3 at once. Build a culture of thinking in the classroom. You got to get them thinking. You got to change the environment to do that, because we can't actually ask students to behave differently inside of an environment that has always told them to behave a certain way. And specifically on that, and I've said this before, classrooms were not designed for thinking. They were designed to create conformity and compliance. That's what they do well, and that's what they've been doing well. And if we want students to think, which in many ways is antithetical to conformity and compliance, we can't ask them to do that inside of an environment that for their entire student career has been telling them to conform and comply, right? We need to change things. So thinking, tasks, random groups, vertical surfaces changes the environment. It creates a space where the students can be different. Then we move to the second toolkit, and there's 5 practices. We do them one at a time and so on, blah, 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 blah. You can look up the details. You can find it anywhere. Like it's all over the place. When that framework was developed, one of the things that became really, really clear to me was that one of the things that's important about professional growth, so when a teacher is growing their practice, is that when you as a teacher make a change in your practice, it has to be met with a reciprocal change in student behavior. Like it just has to be, right? If I make a change in my practice and the students don't change their behavior, I can't sustain that change. And I certainly can't move forward with that change, right? So I make a change, the students have to respond. And this is why this framework is developmental for both the teacher and the students, right? Like the teacher has to learn how to be a teacher in this space. The students have to learn how to be a student in this space. And then we kind of move forward like this, right? And that's what this framework was. It was developmental for both teachers and students and so on and so forth. But that research on what the implementation order should be was done in a BTC vacuum, right? Like at that time, BTC wasn't a hashtag. It didn't have, like VNPS had a sort of a presence on social media. There was some knowledge of it in some small corners of the world here and there, but not like it is today. And I've been wondering a lot lately, if I was to redo that research on the implementation framework, would it be different today, right? Like, because back then I was doing research with a teacher who didn't know, with teachers, there was about 300 or 400 teachers in that phase of the research. Teachers who didn't know what building thinking classrooms was. If they were implementing it, they were the only ones in their building doing it, or they were doing it with the people who had been part of the workshop that the study encompassed, right? Like there wasn't a general discourse about it. It wasn't in the ether the way it is today. So nowadays, if you're a teacher implementing building thinking classrooms for the first time, you may not be the first in your building. You still might be, but you probably heard about it somewhere. There's probably some discourse about it. The kids, there's a high probability that the kids have been immersed in it, at least partially at some point in their academic career now, right? Like it's a different environment. So what would be different? I don't like I haven't had time to do the research. I've been a little busy lately, but I think I suspect that one of the things that would be different is that for example, chapter 12 on building rubrics, I think could move up sooner. I think it should be sooner. It was one of the things I was hoping was going to be sooner, but I think it could get up to the second toolkit. Just because it's such an amazing tool for like sharpening the student behavior within the classroom. But it was assessment, right? Like when we started this work, like assessment was scary. Like building thinking classrooms was scary, and assessment was even scarier. So it was, I think it ended up there because teachers were really reticent to dip their toe into the assessment space. But now maybe the climate has changed in general, but now it's sort of a classroom management tool more so than assessment, right? So I think it can make its way up. I also think that with the work that has really, my work of late, which I've really been focusing on how to close the lesson, may actually cause the toolkits to reorganize a little bit between the second and the third toolkit. I also think that a determined teacher can move through the first and second toolkit a lot faster than they could in the past, because this is now, they're not swimming against the current the same way. They still may within their building, but there's way more support for them in the community to allow them to move forward. So yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. I think it would look a little different, but I'm not sure how. I was surprised the first time around, so I suspect I would be surprised the second time around what the framework would look like.
Right. So one of the things we get asked a lot about the toolkits, and you touched on it a few times in your answer, is how fast do I move through a toolkit? How long do I stay in a toolkit till I get to the next one? And I think it just depends on the teacher, right?
I think, yeah, I actually think it depends on the kids a lot more than it depends on the teacher, right? Like if this is brand new to the students, I think it takes a little longer if they're somewhat familiar with it. There's a lot of places where a lot of good work is happening that's not building thinking classrooms, that's sort of building this space that is just ripe for implementation. You can move through it relatively quickly. I think that the first toolkit we can get through in 2 weeks, right? Like I believe that. When I go in and teach classrooms, so like in the last 2 years, I've taught or co-taught 160 lessons in K to 12. And I would say a third of those are in classrooms where the teacher either has never done it or has only dabbled with it on a very inconsistent basis. And in situations where I get to do 3 lessons in the same classroom, by the third lesson, I'm feeling like, okay, we've built culture. The kids are moving forward. Is it perfect? No, I still got a couple of dragons to slay and a couple of behaviors to manage, but I feel like I'm ready to move on into more sophisticated practices. But that's one of the things to really understand about this developmental framework as well, is that it is a framework for a neophyte teacher and a neophyte group of students. If you have an expert teacher and a neophyte group of students, you can actually handle doing much more. You can't move at a pace faster than the culture builds within the students, but you are not trying to figure out who you're going to be in this space. So if you've been doing building thinking classrooms for 2 or 3 years, and now you get a brand new batch of students coming in tomorrow, like you're gonna, what day one looks like this year is going to be different than day one last year, not because the kids aren't neophytes, but because you are more expert, right? So it's going to shift. And I do talk about that in chapter 15, that year 2 looks different. So it's a framework. It's super important to understand that it's a framework, right? It's not a script. It's not a recipe. It's what our research tells us is going to help you, but you got to make it your own.
Right now, it looks like a lot of members are asking and responding to each other's questions. So I think we're good in the chat.
Well, isn't that
Yeah.
the Facebook group, right? Like
Wonderful.
it's just like the expertise is there.
Yep. So the next question, Peter, has to do with the supporting the wide variety of students in a classroom. Teachers know the importance of going in with the low floor, being prepared for a high ceiling. Some teachers, though, struggle with, for example, if they're in 8th grade classroom and they have students at the 2nd and 3rd grade levels, or maybe a split grade classroom. So the question from the group is, what are some best practices that you have seen or you have practiced to best support such a wide variance of abilities, whether it's during the launch, the task, the check, any part of the process? What can you offer us?
So the first thing is to acknowledge the fact that we have a wide variety, right? Like 160 lessons. It's every one of those classrooms is a sock drawer, right? Like high achievers, low achiever, diagnosed spectrum conditions, students on IEP, students undiagnosed, language learners, right? Like everyone's a sock drawer. Everybody's class is a sock drawer. Thousands and thousands, like 62,000 teachers in the Facebook group. Or I think it's more now, 64,000 or something like that. It just keeps going up.
I think we're at 65. I saw
Okay, there
today.
we
So
go.
hey,
It
woohoo!
was just like a few months ago that it was at 50,000, right? Like,
I know.
so multiply that by the number of lessons that have been taught. And every once in a while, I'm in a class, I'm in a workshop. I was in a workshop the other day, and a teacher goes, "Yeah, but I don't know if this is going to work with my kids." And I'm like, okay, like, I don't think there's any combination of kids that we haven't encountered, right? Like I've worked in some incredibly complex situations, right? High diversity, low performance, low socioeconomic, gang presence. Like we make it work, right? Like I find it really hard to believe that there is a combination of kids out there that we haven't encountered. That's not to say there aren't individual kids, but combinations as a whole where we got to try to make it work as a class. But we have to acknowledge this, like we have diversity, and all the teacherly craft you've built up over the years to deal with that diversity is still relevant. You still have to deal with it. But there are a couple advantages that building thinking classrooms gives you. Number one, it engages students. So, a bored student can often be a problematic student. So engaged students are less problematic, right? Having said that, if you don't have good classroom management skills before you implement this, it's not going to help, right? Like, so there's all of that teacherly craft that you already have in place is of benefit to you here as well. And you just have to apply it slightly differently. So the first step is this: start easy. Start easy. So Jared Sliger, who's one of the Building Thinking Classrooms team members, has this metaphor of backing a train up into the train station, right? Like you just have to back this train as far into the train station as necessary for everybody to get on the train. And then you leave the station, right? And then your job is to just keep everybody on the train, which is a lot easier to do than leaving the station with 2 kids in the snack bar, 3 in the bathroom, and 4 standing on the wrong platform. Because now the train is barreling down the track and 2/3 of your kids are on the train, and you're trying to manage them, and you got 1/3 still standing back at the station trying to figure out what went on, right? So back the train up as far as necessary. So I'll give you a really concrete example. This is a lesson that I've taught or co-taught like 6 times in the last 2 years. And it's the adding fraction example that I gave earlier, right? So in the US, this is often something we do at grade 5. In Canada, we would probably do it in grade 7, but it depends on where you're at and which province or which state you're in. But adding fractions, kids don't come in empty vessels, right? Like they've been seeing fractions since like grade 1 or grade 2. They've even done some rudimentary adding of fractions in grade 2 and 3 and 4 using pie charts and chocolate bars and pizzas and number lines and fraction strips. Like they've been doing some rudimentary, and they also know how to do equivalent fractions. They've been doing some of that rudimentary work. So now we get to grade 5. Let's just say it's grade 5 in one of the US states, and we're going to hit adding fractions hard, right? We got to get them all the way up to adding mixed fractions, different denominators with a regroup needed. And what I mean by regroup is that the fraction portion adds to something greater than 1. So You know, like we got to get them from very rudimentary all the way up to that. And so the launch for that lesson, a lesson that ends with, as I said earlier, 3 2/3 plus 5 3/4, a lesson that ends with that starts with 1/5 plus 3/5. And that's the launch, is I gather the kids around me and I go, I'm going to write a question on the board. You're not allowed to call out the answer. You're not allowed to say anything. You got to, and you can only put up your thumb if you know the answer. So then I write up 1/5 plus 3/5. And I go, if you know the answer, put up your thumb. Don't say anything. You know the answer? I point at a kid. I have their thumb up. I know you know the answer. Don't say it, but you know the answer. And they're like, yeah. And I'm going, okay, don't say it. That's the first question. You got to go take a card off. You go to the board. And the kids are looking at me like I've lost my mind because this question is just so simple. And they're walking to the boards and they're going, I got 4/5. Did you get 4/5? The answer is 4/5, right? Like, what's the problem here? And they're thinking like, this is just too easy, right? But this is because we back the train all the way into the station so that every kid can get on. Now, does that mean that there aren't some kids walking, they're going, I got 4/10, right? But they usually sort that out of the board. They draw a couple of pictures. And if the whole group isn't sorting it out, I step in, I draw some pictures and maybe some number line stuff, and we get it sorted out, right? But then off we go. The train has now left the station. And that train we always get all the way down the track to 3 2/3 plus 5 4/5 every time with everybody on the train, right? But the only way we could do that is by backing it up, right? So one of the things that I always say is plan the thin slicing on the assumption that the kids know it, launch on the assumption that they don't, right? And whatever review you need to do at the beginning just to get them caught up is necessary. Now we can choose to do all that review for all of them, or we can just push in just in time when groups run into trouble, right? But the first rule is start easy. Start so easy that the kids are actually looking at you like, you got to be kidding me, right? Because then everybody's on the train. It's the only way to make sure everybody's on the train. Now, you may still have some kid who's not on the train, but now you already know who that kid is, and you can go and help him get on the train, right? And then you get them going. So that's the first thing. The next thing is to make sure everybody gets to stay involved. So making sure the marker is moving, that students are taking their time explaining to their group mates what's going on, making sure that they're not moving ahead until everybody understands. And of course, I'm talking about 95% of the kids, right? Like there's still going to be situations where you got to push in, you got to pull a kid out, you got to give them a little bit of support, plug them back in, pass the marker to somebody, step into a group, play Columbo. And there's maybe some people in the audience here who remember who Columbo is, but Columbo was this sort of bumbling detective who always fooled all the criminals because he acted like he didn't know what was going on. And that's you. Like you step in and go, okay, hold on. I don't know what you're doing here. Can you just catch me up? And like, you're just going to take this hit. You're just going to ask the silliest questions. You're going to ask for clarification. You're going to get this all for the benefit of the student who's standing right next to you, listening to the answers as well. You're going to do everything you have always done as a teacher to help support these students. And then at the end of the lesson, if there are still some students who have managed to not fully understand, then you can differentiate down in the check your understanding questions. You can pull some kids together while everyone's doing check your understanding questions, do some small group instruction. If you know that there's going to be some students who struggle going into the lesson, you can preload them with some information ahead of time. And I think we've talked about that in a past recording as well. But the reality is that I go into classrooms all the time. The teachers I work with are in classrooms all the time. And you're going to make it work. You're going to make it work imperfectly. But and then you just run around and try to make sure that everyone stays on the train and help out the ones who are starting to fall off and so on. And that's differentiation, right? Except it's real-time differentiation, as opposed to that sort of anticipatory differentiation, where like this group is going to work on these tasks and this group's going to work on these tasks, and this group, well, they're going to work with me, right? It's like, what can I do in the real time to support students? Julie Dixon calls it just-in-time support. And I know there's way more to it, and I can tell stories and there's examples, but it's hard to believe it until you see it.
There's a couple of people asking in the chat about students who are new language learners or multilingual learners. And so I know that you have done some podcasts, I think, or another webinar on that. And so but I wasn't sure which one. Do you remember? Was it the Hand to Mind one?
I can't remember, but I can talk about it here. It's
okay. Maybe just give us a shortened version, maybe.
So first thing you have to understand is that the research in the Orange Book was all done in the lower mainland of British Columbia. It was rare for me to go into a classroom where there was less than 30 or 40% language learners in the room. And a significant portion have just arrived in Canada this year, right? Like, so all of the data that you are reading about in the Orange Book is done in classrooms that have high numbers of language learners. It also, by the way, has really diverse populations in the sense that in that region of Canada, we haven't had special education for 35 years, right? Like 35 years ago, that area of Canada made the decision that we're not going to pull kids out anymore. We're just going to integrate them into the classrooms, and we'll have push and support where necessary. But those are the classrooms in which all this research was done, diverse, and by and large, we don't track either. So it was like, you know, really integrated classrooms with very diverse populations. All right, so what do we do about language learners? So one of the things that would happen early on in the research is I'd go into a classroom, I would see how many language learners were in there, and I'd go, I wonder how this is going to work. And then I'd come out at the end of the lesson, I'd go, I wonder why that worked. And there was a lot of energy put into trying to understand what was working here, because there's a lot of things in this that seem like this shouldn't be working. But the best conclusion I came to is this. Communication in a thinking classroom travels on anywhere between 4 and 6 channels of communication. So what are they? First channel is verbal. The kids are talking to each other. Okay, that's channel number 1. Channel number 2 is written. Okay, so the kids are writing on the whiteboard. And what is being written is synchronized with what is being said. Okay, so there's a synchronization with it. But there's only one marker, right? Super important. Only one marker per group. So channel number 3 is the pointing channel, right? The kids are pointing a lot. They're pointing at the mathematical artifacts that are on the whiteboard that have already been created. Even the kid with the marker is pointing at things that have already been created. And again, that pointing is synchronized with what is being said. Channel number 4 is the gesture channel. And the gesture channel actually travels on 3 sub-channels. So sub-channel number 1 is mathematics is communicated through gestures, right? We gesture with our hands constantly when we're talking mathematics. It's longer, it's more like this. And we're constantly gesturing. The second way gesture is used in a thinking classroom is a gesture communicates emotions, right? And positive emotions travel very strongly between groups through gestures and within groups through gestures. And the third way gesture operates is that gesture makes interrupting not rude. So there's an incredible amount of interrupting that happens in a group during a thinking classroom. It's actually called burstiness in organizational psychology, where one student will say something, another one will pile on, and they pile on, and they're really just interrupting each other. But somehow it's not perceived as rude within the group. And the reason is because prior to any interruptions, there are micro gestures that happen milliseconds prior that are sort of indicating that I'm coming in, and invitations to come in, and so on. So interrupting is not perceived as rude. So those are 4 channels. Then we can add manipulatives. That's a 5th channel. And I think Megan and I did a pretty good job of talking about manipulatives in the Green Book. And we can use technology. And we did a pretty good job of talking about how technology can operate in the thinking classroom as well. So those are 6 channels of communication. What's interesting about them is Only one of them is verbal. All other 5 are visual. So I did these experiments where I would record a group of students working at the whiteboard, and then I would play back for teachers just the audio track. And I would say, what do you think is going on? And nobody ever, not a single person was ever able to tell me what was going on, because the audio track is just so impoverished. It's like you listen to an audio track and it's like, right, no, yeah, it's got to be 7. No, not good. Awesome. 14, high five. And like, that's the audio track. And so what's going on? And the teacher's like, no clue. I don't even know what area of math they're working on, right? But if I play back the video feed without the audio, every single person can understand what's going on. Everybody. Because the video has up to 5 channels, at least 3, but up to 5 channels of communication on it. So when we have a language learner in the classroom, they have just so much more access to information through all these visual means. Does that mean that they don't need support? Absolutely, they need support. But it happens so many times, and Megan and I share these stories about, we did some recording last October in Regina, and it happened twice in one day. One of them where I was teaching a lesson. Grade 1s, and I taught the whole lesson. I connected really well with this one boy, taller than the rest, wearing a yellow shirt. And we were having great communication. He wanted more challenge. He wanted more spicy questions at the end of the lesson. And we were talking back and forth. And then at the end of the lesson, the producer says, we need to interview some kids. I said, interview him. He was awesome. And then the teacher goes, oh, he doesn't speak English. He's only been here for 3 weeks. He speaks no English. And I'm like, how do I not know that? I've been interacting with him the whole lesson. And this happened as well in Hawaii, where I was interacting with a boy who immigrated from Japan the week before, right? It happens all the time where I spend a lesson in these classrooms with kids, and then afterwards, I'm surprised to learn which ones don't actually speak English, because communication is happening. If there's a will, there will be communication. I was in a grade 5 classroom once, and I came up and I gave the extension to a group, these 3 little girls. I gave the extension. I go, everybody got it? And one of the girls goes, she doesn't. And I said, what do you mean she doesn't? And she goes, oh, she just came here from another country from Japan last week. She doesn't speak English. I said, so what are we going to do about that? And she goes, hold on. She goes and grabs an iPad. The teacher had 2 iPads wrapped in rubber with a handle, and she speaks into it and then holds it up for this girl. And it's like talk to text with translation. The girl gives a thumbs up. They're off and running, right? Like, if the kids are willing to communicate, they will find a way to communicate. You can create some opportunities for that through things like text or talk to text and so on and so forth. But by and large, the medium of the whiteboard coupled with gestures and manipulatives is such a transparent space for kids to find ways to make themselves understood and make others understand them. So not a perfect answer, but it's...
No, that was great. Thank you for adding on to that. Our next question is kind of going in a little bit different direction, but I've already seen some people asking in the chat that your work has been spreading, even though your title in the original Orange Book says mathematics in it. It's obviously spreading to many other groups. I know the English group has just exploded this summer. It's crazy. We've had people ask about computer science, social studies, science, like all these different subjects. And so we're just wondering if you could maybe give like some examples of how you've seen it being utilized, BTC being utilized in some of these other places, or if you have any tips or advice for the other subject areas.
Right. Okay. So it's funny. I remember, I think was it last summer, the summer before, there was a tweet from somebody who was doing a workshop, and or they were just at a professional conference or something. And it was like, I think the tweet was a bunch of Canadian science teachers trying to convince a group of American social studies teachers why they should read a book about math. And it was this sort of funny capture of what it is actually that's going on out there. When I first went to write this book, we had serious conversations about whether I should write it for math, or cross-curricular. We decided to write it for math because there was already a movement happening in math, and I'm glad we did. But the work has continued in cross-curricular. There is so much work in Canada right now where when I go into a district, I'm going cross-curricular. I'm going to be doing a lot of work in Hawaii in the next few weeks, and I think 50% of my workshops are whole staff cross-curricular. And there's this real thirst because thinking is a necessary precursor to learning, period. Not thinking in math. Thinking is a precursor to learning. Students have to be thinking if we want them to be learning. And how do we get them thinking in any subject is an important question. Some things are invariant, right? Like random groups of 3, getting them up on a vertical whiteboard, trying to be verbal with our instructions, making sure that the students, we start easy and we build on the challenge through thin slicing or thick slicing. In a lot of non-math subjects, we tend to thick slice more. Like these things are all still relevant, right? Notes, homework, turning homework into check your understanding questions, how we answer questions, how we build autonomy, right? How we close a lesson. Like these things are all still relevant. What really shifts is what constitutes a thinking task. And what I have found is that, like math, every subject, if I open up a textbook into any page that has questions on it, I'm looking at a thinking task. Well, that's not entirely true, but I got about a 50% chance of hitting a thinking task. And what makes it a thinking task has a lot less to do with what the question is and a lot more to do with what we as a teacher do with it, right? So if I pre-teach how to do it, I just turned a great thinking task into a mimicking task. If I overly prescribe a rubric that they have to follow or a graphic organizer that they have to, where I worry much more about form than function, then I'm starting to kind of tell the kids how to do it and what it is that I want them to do, rather than letting them have that creative space to really think about this task. Now, what I said was, when you open up, if I open a language, let's say I open a short story anthology in language arts, I open up a social studies textbook or a science textbook, I got about a 50% chance of hitting a thinking task. So what are the other 50% of the tasks? So a huge number of tasks in those subjects are what I call "Where's Waldo" questions. So these often appear at the end of a section or the end of a chapter or the end of a short story. And what they are is they're questions to make sure that you read the section or the story or the chapter, right? Like the reason I call them "Where's Waldo" questions is because when you assign those questions, the kids don't actually read the text. They just read the question and they go looking for the answer. And those are not thinking tasks. Those are check that you read it tasks. Those are not the thinking tasks that we want to engage in. But the ones that come after that are usually really great thinking tasks, right? They're full of tension and inference in social studies. They look at plot, theme, character development, transposition, and language arts, right? They're asking you to reflect and infer and analyze. And these are all inherently thinking activities. It's us that turns them into something else. So the biggest question is not where do I get the tasks or how do I do this? It's how do I make sure that I don't ruin the inherent nature of the subject by overly prescribing what it is I want the students to do. We have to have a little bit of faith. We have to build a culture of thinking, just like in math. We have to start with non-curriculars. We have to build up that culture. And then we kind of just work the class. And just like in math, if you do Thinking Thursdays, the kids are going to enjoy it, but you're not going to get the big payoff, right? You have to be persistent and consistent. You have to do this on a regular basis to really build up the skills of thinking so that you can start to reap the rewards of learning that come on the heels of that. And there's way more complexity and nuance to that, but that's a good place to start. Read the Orange Book, and then at the end of chapter 1, open up your book, your resource, plow through the questions and ask yourself, what here is a good thinking task? Now, there is some things that we learned working with language arts, and in particular, is that when we're having students produce writing, the most that we can actually have them produce at a whiteboard is a paragraph or a poem. That's about the longest text that we can actually have students co-write together. If we want to go longer than that, they're going to have to shift into individual work, but they can do all the pre-writing together, right? The storyboarding, the brainstorming, the mind map, the outlines, like all of that stuff can be done collaboratively, right? The same is true in computing science. If they're programming, for example, they can be doing the storyboarding, the flow charts, the mind maps in groups of 3. What we found in computing science was, or in, I think that's a newer way to talk about it, is one device, 2 kids. You know, like when we start to think about how do I get them to think, some of these things become pretty clear to us pretty quick. And I'm happy to hear that some of these specialty groups are flourishing, because just like the math group, there's great resources out there. There's someone I follow on Twitter who's a biology teacher, always putting out great stuff, right? So it's like, it's there. There are communities out there. You just got to search for it.
Awesome. Thank you.
I thought we'd have this, our last question, be sort of, general and wide open, and let you speak to whichever pieces you think make sense. And that is, what do you have to say about some of the latest things that have come out of the research, changes that are coming, either have just recently come or are down the pike, and how is, you're in with teachers all the time.
Yeah.
What have you learned recently with all your workshops and things with teachers, is to what works best and what might change with the practices?
So the big thing, and new, like this stuff is in the green book. It'll be in the maroon book that's coming out sometime in the new year, the 6 to 12 book. The new stuff around closing the lesson and how important that is. And I think that work in the last 3 years has just revealed just how vital closing the lesson is, right? Because getting them up at the whiteboard, that's great. We're having a good time. We laugh, we cry, it becomes part of us. It's not everything, right? Like we're creating a meaning-making environment when we get the kids to the whiteboards. We have to help them turn meaning-making into meaning-made. And how we close a lesson is vital for that, right? Like closing off that lesson. And one of the things that has become more and more clear is that, like, we need to spend like a third of the lesson time on closing the lesson. And there are 3 practices that help us close the lesson. How we consolidate. And one of the things that we made really clear in the green book is the difference between consolidating when we have a divergent task, then we do a gallery walk, and when we have a convergent task, then we do a teacher scribe. And my work on that revealed some really particular and easy ways to do that. Meaningful notes, which was one of the things that I really worked hard on to try to get good by the time the Orange Book was published, but I kept working on it ever since, because I wasn't 100% happy with that. And the new templates and frameworks for having students really engage in note making, and how important that is. And then check your understanding questions. Again, how important that is. And we don't have to do all 3. We do not have to do all 3, but we have to do at least one. We have to turn that meaning making into meaning made. We have to help the students organize, structure, and formalize their thinking at the end of the lesson. Otherwise, their ideas are still floating out here. When they're working at the whiteboard, they're having great ideas, but they're still kind of chaotic. And if they walk out of the room, they just float away. We have to help them organize, structure, and formalize their thinking, help them turn meaning making into meaning made. And that's super, super important. And that's where a lot of my energy has been in the last 3 years. But another thing I'll say that is, I think, kind of fascinating is just how sensitive this environment is, you know, we started talking about tasks. So let me tell you about, I was working with a teacher, and she said to me one day, she goes, and I hadn't been in her classroom, but she says to me one day, she says, "What do you do about copying?" I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "You know, when they're at the whiteboards, what do you do about the students copying from each other?" I said, you mean like they'll look over and they'll steal an idea, like, ooh, they're using a T-chart. Let's make a T-chart. No, she says, like, I mean, they're copying symbol for symbol. I'm like, seriously? Like, I've seen that like 4 or 5 times in thousands of classrooms I've been in. Like, I never see that. I'll see a lot of stealing ideas, but not actually copying symbol for symbol. And she's like, yeah, I have like 4 or 5 groups do it every lesson. I'm like, really? So I asked to see what the task sequences she was using, the thin slicing she was doing. And I'm like, yeah, those are great questions. And so that's not the problem. And then I asked her, I started to think about this, and I said, let me ask you some questions. Do you give the kids all the questions all at once on a piece of paper? She goes, yeah, I find it really efficient. And then I said, okay. And when they're done, they get to sit down, right? And she goes, oh yeah, I find that really motivates them. And I'm like, well, you're not wrong. It does motivate them, but what does it motivate, right? It motivates rushing, speed, copying, get her done, right? Like, it's not motivating thinking, being present, right? Like, and what's so ironic about this is the exact sequence, same sequence of tasks where we use the banner instead. The kids get the task one at a time, and nobody ever gets to be done. And now we see a radically different behavior in the students, right? Like, the task is not everything. The same sequence of tasks used well or used poorly can produce vastly different behaviors. And I think this is what I love about building thinking classroom research, is that the things we do as teachers make huge differences, good or bad, right? So it's like, how can we make sure that we're always doing the things that are promoting the thinking rather than the rushing or whatever else the kids are motivated to do? And because of that, we're always on this continuum between effectiveness and efficiency, right? Like, it is more efficient to give the kids all the questions at once. I will agree with that. It is more efficient. It is less effective, right? So it's, how do we move ourselves onto that push always for effectiveness, but not at the cost of becoming so inefficient that we become ineffective, right? But it's always, how do I skew to effectiveness over efficiency? And I think that's the thing that just revitalizes me every time, when we figure out something that I can do, that you can do, that everybody can do, that makes a huge difference in the way the students experience the mathematics, or the language arts, or the social studies, or the science, or the foods and nutrition.
If I could follow up a little on the first piece that you talked about, which is the closing is super important, should be a third of the lesson, and that there's 3 closing practices. And what you said is you don't have to do all 3 every time. So how, as a teacher, do you plan, or do you wait to see how it goes to know whether I should be doing consolidation today or not, only doing check your understanding questions, or do I do them both today, or whatever?
I think it depends a lot on, well, first of all, your proficiency with each of those practices, right? Like, it starts, like, check your understanding questions is in toolkit 2. That's where you're starting. And if you're proficient at that, you can start playing with the other ones. But it's also where you are in your lesson sequence and what's coming up. Like, maybe we don't need to do notes every day. Like, maybe if I just wait one more day, we're going to have more stuff to put on those notes, that it's going to make it richer. I always try to do a consolidation and one of the others, notes or check your understanding questions. I just feel that my contribution to closing the lesson is really, really important. But there's times where I've walked around and visited every group and checked in with them, and I've done a mini consolidation here and there, and I feel like, yeah, they don't need me. They can go straight into check your understanding questions or whatever. So it also depends on how long I have, right? I've gone in and done 30-minute lessons. And it's like things are happening fast. We got 10 minutes for the closing. We're not doing much, but I've also done 90-minute lessons where we're doing all three, right? So it's, as a teacher, I think it's worthwhile to prepare for all three and be prepared for all three, but then to use your best judgment in the moment and read the room and use the formative information that you have, the formative feedback you have based on what the groups are doing and what individual students are doing to decide for yourself what you think is the best way to close this lesson.
Great, thanks. Yeah, the one of the things for me personally that is so great about BTC is that formative assessment. It's just continuous.
Oh, yeah.
All you're doing as a teacher, well, not all you're doing, but one of the big things you're doing as a teacher is just you're analyzing what everyone's doing all the time, every day. It's just the greatest thing.
You have so much information you can use in the moment, and then you can use later on at the end of a lesson or the next day. Like there's just, I feel like I got blinders on when the kids are sitting down. just have no clue what they're doing. But when they're up at the whiteboards, I just feel like I can see everything. And I'm a better teacher for it.
Yeah, I agree. So we're up at about an hour's time. Is there anything in the chat that anyone noticed that is super pressing that we want to ask? Or I know there's lots of questions, and this could go on forever, so we can't obviously let that happen. In fact, it's hard to keep up with them. They scroll by so fast.
I think just a reminder to them, a reminder to the members listening that they could always search for topics in the group if their question wasn't hit upon. And we also have pre-recorded trainings from the summer they could go back to as well.
Yeah.
Right. This event is being recorded, and it will be put in under the event. So if you go into events, you'll see not only this one, you'll see all the summer sessions that you'll mention, and there's lots of stuff in there.
Yeah. And just
go ahead.
last comments here, right? Like, I've done 160 lessons the last 2 years. Ask me how many I did perfect. Like, how many do I come out of that going, yeah, that was perfect. Don't change a thing. Laminate the sequence. We're never going to change it. Nailed it. Right? Like, it was 0. Every single time we came out of a lesson going, no, we need more of that. We needed less of that. That one really stalled them out. That should have come later. We needed to cut those. Right. But now we're ready. The second time is going to be better. Right. And the third time is going to be better than that. But I can promise you that not one of those kids from those 160 lessons was sitting around the dinner table that night going, ooh, Mr. L really screwed up the thin slicing today. Right. Not one of them. I saw some people saying there, like, I don't feel ready, but I'm just going to try. Yeah, that's it. That's the right attitude. Right. We're never going to be perfect, but we will be more perfect the second time.
All right, well, terrific. Thank you again so much, Peter, for your time. This is great that we can do this periodically. Every time I hear you speak, whether it's here or somewhere else, I've learned so much, even though I've been doing this for a while now. So it's just so nice having you, give your time to talk to us. So we really appreciate it.
And thanks for all the time all of you give to the Facebook group, and not just here, but like on a day-to-day basis. So happy to come back whenever you want me.
All right, terrific. Well, we'll do that another time. All right, well, thank you very much. And we'll stop the meeting now, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everybody.